had planned to visit my son on Thanksgiving Day, but he gave me a cold reception. He told me that I was not welcome and that they had only invited his in-laws. I left his home without a word, concealing the deep sense of hurt I felt. About a month later, his perfect life with his wealthy in-laws fell apart completely, and he frantically called me. I decided to call Daniel before I could change my mind. My elbows were propped on the sturdy mahogany desk as I waited for him to pick up, watching the late autumn light dance on the lake through my study window. My late wife, Martha's, empty chair was by the fireplace, still turned toward mine just as it was during our last conversation. Daniel's voice sounded distant and distracted. I told him that I wanted to discuss our Thanksgiving plans. I had been thinking about the menu, and I suggested we could try Martha's sage stuffing recipe this year. He immediately informed me that his family would be hosting at their place and that everything had already been decided. His words were a shock. My pen slipped from my fingers, making a clattering sound on the open notebook where I had meticulously jotted down guest lists and menus. I asked what he meant by saying everything was decided. He explained that Sarah's parents were flying in from Phoenix, and they had already made dinner reservations and ordered the turkey. Everything was already handled, he said. I pressed the phone against my ear, wishing I could feel some warmth in his tone, but there was none. I reminded him that we always hosted Thanksgiving at my house. For 43 years, this house had been the center of our holiday, and my wife had loved it. Daniel told me that was his mom's tradition, not his. Pages in the notebook fluttered from a draft coming from the heating vent. Each page showed years of careful planning, guest counts, and menu adjustments. Martha's precise handwriting noted dietary restrictions, and she had made notes for the last time just 2 years ago, before her diagnosis, before everything changed. I was confused. I told him I didn't understand. He explained that last year was different because Sarah's parents could not travel, but this year they could. He said they were doing it right this year with professional catering and a proper dining room. The word right tasted bitter on my tongue, and I questioned what he meant by that. The connection crackled with static, and I heard Sarah's voice in the background, sharp and demanding, although I couldn't make out what she was saying. Daniel muffled the phone and spoke to her, then told me he had to go because they were meeting the caterers in 20 minutes. The line went silent. I stared at the phone, its dark screen reflecting the gray lake water. The silence was broken only by the gentle sound of waves lapping against the dock where Martha used to sit with her morning coffee. My coffee had grown cold hours ago, forgotten next to my Thanksgiving plans, which now seemed worthless. I remembered that 43 years ago, Martha had counted our Thanksgivings, weak but determined to make one last perfect meal. She stood in this same room, leaning against the doorframe because it hurt too much to stand. She told me how proud she was of our traditions. The notebook was open to this year's page. At the top, in my careful engineer's handwriting, it read November 28, 2024. The Miller Family Thanksgiving. Below were columns of planned dishes, schedules, and shopping lists, all of which were useless now. I closed the notebook and walked to the living room where Martha's chair waited for me. I sat in her chair and it felt like being embraced by an old friend. The leather still held the faint impression of her smaller frame, and I could still sense the faint scent of apple cinnamon that she used to wear. I pulled the photo album from the side table. The first picture showed Martha at 26, with flour in her dark hair, attempting to make my grandmother's dinner rolls. The kitchen looked different back then, with yellow wallpaper instead of the sage green Martha chose later. She was laughing, her eyes bright with the challenge of mastering family recipes. She had announced that first Thanksgiving that the rolls were terrible, but she vowed she would master them. Took her 3 years. By the fourth Thanksgiving, her rolls were better than my grandmother's had ever been. I turned the page. Daniel, a toddler, was standing on a kitchen stool, carefully spooning cranberry sauce into serving bowls. His tongue was poking out in concentration, just as it did when he built with Legos or worked on math problems. Martha was standing behind him, ready to catch him if he wobbled. I remembered him asking his mom if he could make the gravy next year because his dad let him use the whisk. Martha promised he could if he practiced. She told him that there were no lumps allowed at the Miller table. The next photo showed Daniel at 16, taller than Martha, with his arm around her shoulders as they stood by the dining room table. The good china gleamed in the candlelight, and the turkey was golden and perfect. Daniel's face showed that awkward teenage pride. He was old enough to appreciate the work that went into it but young enough to take it for granted. That was the year he brought his first serious girlfriend, Jessica Mitchell. Martha had spent weeks polishing silver that was already spotless and practicing conversation topics that would not embarrass him. After dinner, I found her in the kitchen, with tears streaming down her face. She insisted they were happy tears, saying that he was growing up so beautifully. Jessica broke up with him 2 weeks later, but Martha's joy lasted for months. The final photo in the sequence showed last year's table. Martha was sitting in her usual place, her cashmere scarf concealing what the chemotherapy had taken. Her smile remained brilliant, and her hands were steady as she carved the turkey with the precision of decades of practice. Daniel was sitting next to Sarah, both of them periodically checking their phones but still present. While washing dishes later, Martha had whispered to me that this might be her last Thanksgiving. She made me promise that I would make sure our traditions continued and that Daniel remembered what was important. I promised her. Standing in our kitchen with soap bubbles clinging to my hands, I had sworn that our family's Thanksgiving would survive whatever came next. The photo album slipped from my lap as I reached for the fireplace poker. The flames needed stirring, but my hands were shaking too much to manage it. The house felt huge, and every empty room echoed with conversations that would never happen again. Martha's presence lingered here most, in her chair, surrounded by the life we built together. But even that was fading now, like the morning mist over the lake. Soon, there would be nothing left but memories, and even those seemed not to be worth keeping. I closed the album and set it aside. My old dog, Max, whimpered from his bed by the fireplace. He had a supernatural sense for my moods, and his tail thumped once against the hearthstone. I told him to come on, getting up with a surprising amount of effort. I said we would take a walk before it got dark. His collar jingled as he stretched and padded toward the back door, leaving me alone with the photographs and the growing certainty that everything I had cherished was already gone. Morning frost crunched under my boots as Max and I followed our usual path around Lakewood Park. My golden retriever trotted ahead, occasionally looking back to check on me with the intuitive concern of a creature that had watched me grieve for 11 months. The conversation I had with Daniel yesterday felt different in the daylight. It seemed less like a betrayal and more like a necessary change that I needed to accept. Problems required solutions. My engineering background had taught me that much. Resistance created stress, but adapting ensured survival. I considered that perhaps Daniel was right to move on, to build new traditions with Sarah's family. Martha would not have wanted me to cling to the past at everyone else's expense. The lake stretched out before us, mirror smooth in the November stillness. Other early walkers nodded as they passed us, the retired teacher with her old beagle and a young father pushing a stroller. They were normal people adapting to normal changes. I knew that I could do this. My phone buzzed against my chest. The caller ID showed Sarah's name, surprising me so much that I almost dropped the phone before I could answer. Her voice was full of the forced enthusiasm she used to sound caring. She said that she and Daniel would like to invite me to their Thanksgiving dinner. They would love to see me, and she told me to be there at 2 o'clock sharp. She said not to be late because I knew how John was about punctuality. She laughed, and the sound was like wind chimes in a gentle breeze. She told me to dress nicely because they were going to take a lot of pictures this year. Hope swelled inside of me like the sunrise after a long night. I felt sure that Daniel had not forgotten to invite me but just wanted to wait until they had a definite time for the celebration to start. Sarah was calling to include me, to make sure I felt welcome in their new tradition. My voice was thick with gratitude as I accepted. I asked if I should bring anything special, like wine or flowers. Sarah told me I was so sweet and to just come by myself. She said that Daniel was taking care of everything else because he was very particular about his parties. They were calling it a party instead of a family dinner, but I knew I could adapt. It was important to be together to honor Martha's memory while staying connected with Daniel. Martha would have approved of this flexibility. I promised I would be there at 2 and thanked Sarah for calling. I told her it meant a lot to me and that I would see her Thursday. The line went dead, but the warmth remained. Max had stopped to investigate something interesting in the grass. His tail wagged as he marked his territory, and life continued in its essential patterns. I looked across the water toward home, mentally calculating what I needed to do. I would select a good bottle of wine from the cellar, something impressive but not ostentatious. I would wear my navy suit, the one Martha had helped me choose for Daniel's wedding. I had a week to mentally prepare for meeting Sarah's parents and to gracefully navigate these new family dynamics. The walk home felt lighter than it had in months. Max seemed to sense the change, bounding ahead with renewed energy, occasionally circling back to make sure I was keeping pace. Even the November air felt less harsh, carrying promises of warmth waiting indoors. Problems and solutions. Martha had always told me I was at my best when I had something to fix, something to build. Now I had a new project, to learn how to be the father-in-law that Sarah's parents deserved and the family member that Daniel needed me to become. The house welcomed us back with familiar creaks and settling sounds. I unleashed Max at the back door, watching him trot toward his water bowl with the satisfaction of a morning well spent. The kitchen clock showed 8:45, plenty of time to plan properly. I could not wait for Thursday to arrive. The week passed by in careful preparation. I selected a bottle of 1998 Chateau Margaux from Martha's collection and wrapped it in tissue paper that whispered secrets. My navy suit was pressed and ready, and my shoes were polished to a mirror brightness. I rehearsed conversations with Sarah's parents, practicing gracious responses to questions about retirement and adjusting to widowerhood. Thursday arrived, crisp and clear. By 1:30, I was walking up the brick pathway to Daniel's house in Maplewood Heights. The expensive wine was cradled in my arms like a peace offering. The neighborhood screamed success. Manicured lawns, 3-car garages, and security systems with blinking green lights on every door frame. Cars lined the circular driveway. A silver Mercedes and a black BMW. Daniel's practical Honda looked humble beside them. I knocked firmly, arranging my face into the welcoming expression I had practiced. The door swung open and revealed Daniel wearing pressed khaki pants and a sweater vest. He looked like he had stepped out of a catalog. His face went pale when he saw me. I said I was right on time and lifted the wine bottle slightly, telling him I was there at 2, just as Sarah had said. Daniel's mouth opened and closed before he stepped out onto the porch, pulling the door almost closed behind him. He said he had forgotten to call me back. The words hung between us like suspended glass, ready to shatter. I asked him what he meant about calling me back. He told me that after Sarah had talked to me, they had decided that they just wanted to celebrate with her parents this year. He said they wanted it to be a family-only gathering. The phrase hit me like a physical blow, stealing my breath. I told him that I was his family. Daniel could not meet my eyes. From inside the house, I heard laughter and the clinking of crystal. It was the sounds of a celebration that I could never be a part of. The Mercedes belonged to John and Lisa. They were Sarah's real family, the ones to impress. Daniel told me it was complicated. He told me that John had given them a 2-story house 3 days ago, and that he had already signed the deed. He said they had nothing to thank me for this year because I had been depressed and living in the past. It was as if our family's 43 years of celebrating Thanksgiving were just practice runs, inadequate rehearsals for the real holiday and the real gifts. I looked down at the wine in my hands. The bottle cost more than most people spend on groceries in a month. I felt stupid. Daniel tried to find the words to explain his decision, and he chose the cruelest possible option. He told me that since my wife had passed away, I had been falling apart. He said they thought it would be easier this way. Falling apart. As if grief were a personal failure. As if losing Martha meant I was broken beyond repair. The bottle of wine in my hand shook. I said quietly that I had prepared for this. I bought the wine and I had pressed my suit. Daniel said he knew and that he was truly sorry. He said maybe we could work something out next year. Next year. Another promise as empty as the space where I should have been sitting at their table. He was already backing toward the door, eager to return to his real celebration with his real family. I told him to keep the wine and place the bottle on the porch step. I told him to give it to John, and I said I was sure he would appreciate the vintage. I turned away before he could respond, walking back down the brick pathway with measured steps that took everything I had. The door closed behind me with a soft click that echoed like a gunshot. The Mercedes gleamed in the driveway, pristine and expensive. Through the dining room window, I glimpsed Sarah laughing at something an older man in a suit was saying. He was her father, the one whose approval mattered more than 43 years of family tradition. I reached my car and sat motionless, with my hands resting on the steering wheel. From inside Daniel's house, I heard the muffled sound of celebration, of family gathering the way families should, just not with me. The wine bottle sat abandoned on the porch step, reflecting the November light like a beacon of everything I had lost. I sat in my car outside Lakewood Shopping Center, the engine silent, and my hands were still trembling around the steering wheel. The wine bottle rested in the passenger seat like an accusation, its burgundy label catching reflections from the overhead lights. Families streamed past my windows, loaded with last-minute Thanksgiving supplies. Their conversations were muffled but unmistakably warm. 45 minutes had passed since Daniel had closed the door on me, since he had chosen John's money over 43 years of family traditions. My engineering mind began working despite the emotional numbness. Problems required analysis before solutions emerged. I had been treating Daniel's behavior as distance caused by grief, but the evidence suggested something far more calculated. The missed visits during Martha's chemotherapy. I had made excuses for him, citing work pressure and Sarah's schedule conflicts. But Daniel had found time for weekend golf trips and dinner parties with Sarah's colleagues. He had attended exactly 3 of Martha's 27 treatment appointments, and the conversations about inheritance had started 6 months before my wife's death. I remembered Daniel asking me if I had updated my will recently, along with other casual questions about the value of my house and my retirement accounts. I had answered him honestly, taking his questions as a sign of his concern for me. Martha had noticed his change in behavior. One evening, after he had cut a visit short to attend some work function, she had whispered to me that he was changing. She told me that money had a way of making people different and had asked me to promise her that I would be careful. At the time, I had dismissed her worries as a result of the chemotherapy. During her final months, she had seen threats everywhere. In the doctor's expressions, in the insurance paperwork, and in Daniel's increasingly short phone calls. I had attributed her fears to the side effects of her medication, and I realized now how blind I had been. The shopping center was bustling with normal families getting ready for their own celebrations. I saw a grandfather helping his grandson load a turkey into their car, and they were both laughing at something I couldn't hear. The boy looked about the same age Daniel was in my favorite photograph, the one where he stood on his tiptoes to reach the cranberry sauce. I knew that child was gone. He had probably been gone for years. The man who had blocked his own father's entrance to a Thanksgiving dinner was someone else entirely. He was someone who viewed our relationship as a financial transaction rather than a relationship of love. The bottle of wine seemed to be mocking me. I had spent so much money on a gesture that Daniel would never appreciate or even understand. He would probably serve it to John, casually mentioning that his father had dropped by unannounced with a gift. My chest ached with something far deeper than simple embarrassment. I realized this was betrayal in its purest form. It was not the dramatic kind you see in movies, but a slow erosion of love through a cold calculation of convenience. Daniel had not intentionally tried to hurt me. He had simply decided I was no longer worth the effort. This realization brought me a sense of clarity instead of tears. Martha had left me more than just memories. She had given me resources, independence, and the power to make my own choices about my future instead of waiting for Daniel to remember his obligations. I started the car's engine and pulled out of the parking lot, leaving the wine on the passenger seat where it belonged as a reminder of my final attempt at reconciliation. The drive home took me exactly 18 minutes, which was enough time to conclude that some relationships, once broken, were not worth repairing. My house welcomed me back with its familiar creaks and settling sounds. I let Max out into the backyard, made some fresh coffee, and checked the mail. These normal routines helped my engineer's mind move from a state of shock to a new strategy. By 6:30, the November darkness had settled around the windows, making the study feel more like a sanctuary than a prison. My hands were steady as I opened the safe behind my desk. The documents inside represented 40 years of careful planning. They included insurance policies, investment statements, and property deeds, everything Martha and I had built together. Everything we had intended to pass down to a family that would honor our memory. The will was on top. Its legal language was as precise as any blueprint I had ever drafted. I saw that the current beneficiary was listed as Daniel Miller, the sole heir. The numbers spoke for themselves. The house was valued at $850,000, and my savings accounts totaled $420,000. The life insurance payout was $300,000. Nearly $1. $5 million was waiting for someone who couldn't spare 2 hours for a Thanksgiving dinner. I examined the document with the same focus I had once given to structural engineering problems. Martha and I had updated the will 3 years ago when Daniel married Sarah. We had been so proud and so confident in our son's character. The will reflected our optimism, leaving everything to Daniel with provisions for grandchildren we had hoped to have. Now, those provisions felt like a naive fantasy from parents who had truly believed that blood meant loyalty. The legal language was quite straightforward. Beneficiaries could be changed with the proper documentation and witnesses. The process would require exactly one appointment with Walter Thompson, my attorney and oldest friend. Walter had handled all our legal needs for 20 years. I knew he would understand the necessity of this without requiring a detailed explanation. Daniel would never suspect the change. Children rarely ask about wills until after a funeral, assuming their inheritance is guaranteed by genetics rather than affection. He would continue planning his future around money he had already lost, making decisions based on resources that would vanish the moment my heart stopped beating. I felt that the irony was perfect. If Daniel wanted to treat our relationship like a business transaction, we would play by business rules. If he only wanted money from his father, he would discover exactly what our relationship was worth. I pulled out a fresh legal pad and began taking notes. I was not seeking revenge, but justice. Martha had built this wealth with me through decades of shared sacrifice. She had worried about Daniel's changing priorities during her final months. This decision would honor her concerns while protecting everything we had worked to create. The new beneficiary would require careful consideration. Walter's law firm handled charitable trusts, so there were options like educational foundations, medical research, and community development projects. These were organizations that would use the Miller family wealth to help people who actually needed assistance rather than funding more luxury vacations and status symbols. Daniel would learn about the change eventually, of course, probably at the reading of my will whenever that day came. I imagined his expression when Walter announced that the Miller family fortune had been redirected to benefit strangers rather than an ungrateful son. The thought brought me more satisfaction than it probably should have. But satisfaction felt better than humiliation, and planning felt infinitely better than helpless acceptance. I closed the safe but left the will on my desk next to Martha's photograph. She smiled at me from the silver frame, her eyes bright with the intelligence that had recognized Daniel's transformation before I did. I quietly told her that she had been right about him, but that she would be proud of what would happen next. Outside, the wind rattled the November trees, but inside the study, I felt a perfect sense of calm. Thompson Bradley and Associates was on the 4th floor of Lakewood's only downtown high-rise. Its brass nameplate gleamed under the fluorescent lights that had witnessed 40 years of legal consultations. I rode the elevator up on a Tuesday morning, 3 days after Thanksgiving, carrying a manila folder with documents that would reshape my family's future forever. Walter Thompson's secretary showed me into his corner office at exactly 10 o'clock. Our 20 years of friendship had at least earned me the courtesy of being seen on time. Walter rose from behind his mahogany desk, which was smaller than mine at home but covered with the organized chaos of an active legal practice. He shook my hand with the firm grip of someone who had built trust through decades of honest work. He told me that I had sounded serious on the phone. I told Walter that I needed to change my will and completely restructure it. His eyebrows rose slightly. At 65, Walter had handled enough family drama to recognize the signs, but his expression remained professionally neutral. He told me that it was a significant decision and asked if he could inquire what had prompted it. I settled into the leather client chair, feeling its familiar comfort. This office had been the setting for Martha's will, our house purchases, and even Daniel's adoption paperwork 30 years ago. Now, it would serve a different purpose entirely. I carefully explained that family circumstances had changed and that I wanted to establish a charitable foundation instead of an individual inheritance. Walter reached for his legal pad, his pen already moving. He suggested the name, the Martha Miller Memorial Foundation. I told him that was exactly right. The name had come to me during my weekend planning sessions. Martha would have approved of helping others rather than funding ingratitude. Walter told me that it was a significant change and asked if I was certain. I told him that I had never been more certain about anything. He studied my face with the practiced eye of someone who had guided many clients through difficult decisions. He asked about Daniel, noting that he had been my sole beneficiary for 20 years. I explained that Daniel would be fine since he had made other arrangements for his financial future. Walter's pen paused. He asked me if Daniel knew about the change. I told him he did not and that I wanted to keep it confidential until it was necessary. I asked if the foundation could be established without his knowledge. He assured me that it could, explaining that client confidentiality covers all estate planning decisions. Walter made additional notes and asked me what focus areas I wanted for the foundation. I told him I wanted to focus on education, medical research, and community development. I had considered this question extensively. I explained that I wanted to provide educational scholarships for engineering students because Martha had always said that education was the best investment in someone's future. He agreed it was an excellent choice and wrote the name, the Martha Miller Memorial Foundation for Engineering Education, across the top of a fresh page. He said we would first need to establish the foundation structure and then modify my will to designate it as the primary beneficiary. The paperwork took 2 hours. Articles of incorporation, foundation bylaws, and beneficiary designations. Walter's expertise guided me through the legal language that would protect Martha's memory while serving students who truly valued an education. Walter explained that the foundation would be official within 10 business days as I signed the final documents. He told me that my will modification would take effect immediately upon notarization. I watched the notary seal stamp my signature, feeling a sense of lightness that I had not felt since Thanksgiving. I thought to myself that justice wore legal robes and carried official seals, but it still counted as justice. Walter then asked me a question as my friend rather than my attorney. He wanted to know if I was doing this for the right reasons, explaining that charity work should come from generosity, not anger. I considered his concern carefully. I knew Walter deserved honesty, even if it wasn't a complete disclosure. I told him I was doing this because Martha had built this wealth with me and that she would want it used to help people who appreciated opportunities instead of taking them for granted. Walter nodded slowly. He said that sounded like something Martha would say, and he agreed that she had always been the more practical one in our marriage. I left his office carrying copies of documents that would eventually surprise Daniel, but not until after my funeral. By then, he would have had years to appreciate the consequences of choosing money over family. The elevator descended smoothly, carrying me toward a future where my legacy would outlive my disappointments. December arrived with early snow and the comfortable routine of holiday preparations. The Martha Miller Memorial Foundation was now officially incorporated and ready to receive everything I had worked for 40 years to accumulate. Daniel remained completely unaware of his vanished inheritance, planning his future around wealth that no longer belonged to him. I met Walter for lunch at Lake Grill on December 22nd. It was our traditional pre-Christmas meal, and we had been doing it for 15 years. The restaurant overlooked the frozen lake where Martha and I had taken countless winter walks. Today, ice fishermen dotted the surface like patient sentinels. As he cut into his salmon, Walter told me that the foundation paperwork was complete. He said I would receive quarterly reports on the scholarship distribution starting next year. I said that was excellent and asked if there were any interesting applicants so far. He said there were several promising engineering students from Colorado State. I thought that Martha would be proud of the caliber of the candidates. I smiled, feeling the satisfaction of having my plans properly executed. The foundation would help deserving students while keeping my wealth away from someone who had proven to be unworthy of it. Walter set down his fork, his expression shifting to professional concern. He told me that speaking of legal matters, he had an interesting consultation request last week. John had asked him to represent him. The name hit me like a splash of cold water. John. I asked if Walter knew him, keeping my voice carefully neutral. I told him I had heard the name and asked what kind of representation he had requested. He told me it was a financial fraud investigation and that federal prosecutors were building a case against his development company. Walter shook his head, saying that he had declined the request because of ethical concerns. He said that John's situation looked quite serious. My engineering mind began to connect the pieces. I knew that John was Sarah's father, the man whose approval had mattered more to Daniel than our 43 years of family traditions. I wondered why John would need a criminal defense attorney. I asked what kind of fraud it was. Walter glanced around the restaurant to ensure our conversation remained private. He said it was an investment scheme, promising high returns on development projects that never existed. He said it was a classic Ponzi scheme, using new investor money to pay earlier clients. The pieces of the puzzle aligned with mechanical precision. John's expensive gifts to Daniel and Sarah, the Mercedes in their driveway, and the generous father-in-law who had impressed them enough to abandon our family traditions. I asked how much money we were talking about. Walter told me that according to preliminary reports, it was somewhere north of $2 million. He had been operating the scheme for approximately 18 months. 18 months. That timeline matched the period of Daniel's marriage when he had started mentioning Sarah's successful parents and their investment opportunities. I wondered if Daniel and Sarah had received money from John's criminal enterprise. Had they unknowingly become beneficiaries of fraud? I asked when the investigation began. Walter explained that the FBI had gotten involved in October, but the Colorado Attorney General's office had been watching his company since last summer. He said that financial crimes moved slowly until they accelerated rapidly. I thought about October, which was before Thanksgiving, before Daniel had chosen John's approval over our family's traditions. While I had been planning menus and organizing family celebrations, federal prosecutors had been building a case against my son's preferred father figure. The irony was almost perfect. Daniel had sacrificed our relationship for an association with a criminal. Sarah's family wealth was built on stolen money. The Thanksgiving celebration that had excluded me was funded by fraud. Walter continued eating, unaware of the family drama that his information had illuminated for me. Walter told me that he had referred John to criminal defense specialists in Denver because his situation required an expertise that he did not provide. I asked what happened to assets that were acquired through the proceeds of fraud. He said it was civil forfeiture. He explained that if prosecutors could prove that property was purchased with stolen money, it would be seized regardless of its current ownership status. I thought about Daniel's house and the expensive gifts that John had lavished on his daughter and son-in-law. I realized that if those purchases came from fraud proceeds, Daniel might face legal complications beyond simple disappointment. I said it sounded like an interesting case, maintaining a neutral tone. I said it sounded like John's family might face difficult times ahead. Walter nodded grimly. He said that financial crimes affected entire families. Children, spouses, and even close associates could find themselves under scrutiny. The ripple effects extended far beyond the primary perpetrator. I finished my lunch with new information that changed everything about Daniel's situation. My son had not just chosen money over family loyalty. He had chosen criminal money. The justice I had achieved through the establishment of my foundation was about to be supplemented by federal law enforcement. Sometimes the universe provided its own revenge, more thorough than anything I could have planned alone. The parking garage elevator carried me down 3 floors while my engineering mind assembled the pieces Walter had inadvertently provided. John, the impressive father-in-law who'd convinced Daniel to abandon family traditions, was a criminal facing federal prosecution. The Mercedes in Daniel's driveway, the expensive gifts, the generous family holidays, all funded by stolen money. I drove home through December streets decorated with holiday lights. Each twinkling bulb reminded me of Christmases when Daniel had valued family over status. That version of my son had vanished gradually, replaced by someone who measured relationships through balance sheets rather than love. The house welcomed me back with familiar warmth. I made fresh coffee and settled in my study, where foundation documents waited on the mahogany desk like proof of better choices. The Martha Miller Memorial Foundation had already distributed its first scholarships to 3 engineering students whose gratitude letters sat beside the legal paperwork. John's situation created an interesting moral equation. My son had chosen wealthy in-laws over his own father, believing their financial success would secure his future. Now, those same in-laws threatened to destroy everything Daniel had worked to build. The irony was mathematically perfect. I could warn Daniel about John's troubles. A simple phone call would alert him to investigate his financial arrangements, possibly saving him from whatever schemes John had orchestrated. The loving father I'd been 6 months ago would have made that call immediately, but loving fathers deserved loving sons in return. Daniel had demonstrated clearly where his loyalties resided. When forced to choose between family traditions and impressive in-laws, he'd selected money over memory. When faced with honoring Martha's legacy or impressing John, he'd chosen status over sentiment. Natural consequences made excellent teachers. Daniel had chosen his path deliberately, dismissing my concerns and my feelings in favor of John's approval. If that decision carried hidden costs, perhaps those costs would provide education that fatherly advice had failed to deliver. I opened the foundation files and reviewed progress reports. 3 students now had full scholarships thanks to Martha's memory. Next year, there would be more. The money Daniel had counted on inheriting was already helping people who appreciated opportunities rather than expecting them. John's legal troubles would resolve themselves through federal prosecutors and defense attorneys. Daniel's financial complications would teach him lessons about trusting the wrong people for the wrong reasons. Neither situation required my intervention or my emotional investment. The coffee grew cold while I calculated the elegant justice unfolding without my participation. Daniel had wanted independence from family obligations. He was about to receive exactly what he'd requested, along with comprehensive education about the difference between family wealth and criminal proceeds. I filed the foundation papers in their proper folder and closed the desk drawer. Martha smiled at me from her silver frame, her expression warm with approval. She had always understood that some mistakes required personal experience rather than parental prevention. Outside, snow began falling against the study windows, each flake catching lamplight like tiny stars. The winter evening felt peaceful and complete, unmarred by obligations to ungrateful children, or concerned for consequences they had chosen to create. Tomorrow would bring whatever developments John's troubles had generated. Tonight belonged to quiet satisfaction and the comfort of decisions made with careful thought rather than emotional impulse. Justice served itself when people understood its requirements clearly enough to step aside and let it work. Christmas Eve approached with the gentle routine of holiday preparations unmarked by family complications. I spent Monday evening addressing greeting cards to friends, organizing gifts for charitable distribution, and reviewing foundation applications that would distribute next year's scholarships. The Martha Miller Memorial Foundation had grown beyond my initial expectations, attracting additional donations from community members who'd known Martha's generous spirit. Dinner consisted of leftover soup and fresh bread, eaten while reading engineering journals by the fireplace. Max dozed contentedly on his favorite rug, occasionally twitching through dreams that probably involved chasing lake ducks. The house felt complete and purposeful, no longer echoing with emptiness or regret. My phone rang at 7:45, interrupting an article about sustainable bridge design. Daniel's name appeared on the caller ID, surprising me enough that I considered letting it go to voicemail. Curiosity won over caution. His voice carried panic I'd never heard before, even during his worst childhood crisis. "I need to talk to you. It's urgent." "What's wrong, Daniel?" John deceived me. The house, the gifts, everything was a lie. Words tumbled over each other in desperate rush. I'm in serious financial trouble, and I don't know what to do. I leaned back in Martha's chair, feeling strangely calm, despite Daniel's obvious distress. Slow down and explain clearly. The house John gave us isn't actually a gift. Comes with massive monthly payments I can't afford. Payments he never mentioned when we signed the papers. The mortgage, the maintenance fees, the property taxes. It's more than my entire salary. You signed documents without reading them. John said it was just formality paperwork for the gift transfer. He handled everything through his company's lawyers. I trusted him completely. Daniel's voice cracked with strain. Now I understand it was all a setup to trap us in debt. The engineering problem solver in me automatically began calculating implications while the father in me remained carefully neutral. What exactly did you sign? Everything. Mortgage guarantees, personal liability agreements, maintenance contracts. John structured it so we're responsible for costs that total nearly $8,000 monthly. We can't afford it, but we can't get out of it without losing everything we've put into the house. $8,000 monthly. Daniel's IT salary probably covered half that amount, leaving him completely dependent on sources he'd assumed were generous gifts rather than calculated traps. Have you spoken to an attorney? I can't afford one. Every penny goes to keeping up with these payments. Sarah's beside herself. Her parents have disappeared. Won't return calls. Won't explain anything. Daniel's breathing sounded ragged. Dad, I made a terrible mistake choosing them over you. I realize that now. Can you help me? The question hung between us like suspended weight. 6 months ago, I would have responded immediately with whatever assistance Daniel needed. Tonight, I felt only analytical detachment and mild curiosity about how far his desperation extended. Help you how? Financially, a loan to cover the payments until I can figure out legal options or advice. You always knew how to solve complicated problems. His voice dropped to barely above whisper. I'm sorry about Thanksgiving. I'm sorry about everything. I know I hurt you badly. Sorry. The word carried less weight than I'd expected. Apologies offered during crisis rarely reflected genuine understanding. Only desperate attempts to access resources that suddenly seemed necessary. This is quite a situation, Daniel. I need time to consider what might be possible. Silence stretched through the connection. Daniel had probably expected immediate rescue, the way I'd always provided solutions during his childhood difficulties. Adult problems required adult solutions, particularly when those problems resulted from adult choices made against explicit parental advice. How much time? He asked finally. I'll call you back when I've had opportunity to think it through properly. I ended the call before Daniel could argue or plead further. The study felt exactly as peaceful as it had before the interruption, unchanged by knowledge of my son's financial catastrophe. John's scheme had worked perfectly, just not in the direction Daniel had anticipated. The impressive father-in-law had indeed provided education about wealth and status, specifically about the difference between earning respect and buying it. Martha's photograph caught lamplight as I returned the phone to its cradle. Her expression seemed amused rather than sympathetic, as if she'd anticipated this conversation long before I had. Outside, snow continued falling through the December darkness, covering everything in clean whiteness that would last until morning brought whatever complications tomorrow chose to deliver. Christmas Day buzzed with holiday morning energy when I arrived at 9 o'clock carrying a manila folder that would complete my understanding of Daniel's situation. Walter sat in our usual corner booth, surrounded by legal documents, and wearing the expression of someone who'd worked through Christmas Eve morning to accommodate an urgent client request. Tom, this better be important. Helen's expecting me home by 11 o'clock for gift wrapping. I slid into the booth opposite him, noting the careful organization of papers that marked Walter's professional thoroughness. I need complete details about John Green's legal troubles. Everything you can share professionally. Walter's eyebrows rose. That's oddly specific. May I ask why? Family reasons. I can't explain more without compromising confidentialities, but I need to understand exactly what John did and who might be affected. Fair enough. Walter opened his briefcase and withdrew a thick file. John Green orchestrated a sophisticated debt transfer scheme disguised as generous gifts to family members. The FBI investigation reveals he moved his company's massive liabilities onto unsuspecting relatives through fraudulent property transfers. How does that work legally? Simple but effective. John would gift expensive properties to family members. But the gift documents contained hidden mortgage obligations, maintenance contracts, and personal liability guarantees. Recipients signed without reading, trusting the generous benefactor. Walter shook his head grimly. The victims become legally responsible for debts they never knew existed. I felt the final puzzle piece click into place. Daniel's house gift wasn't generosity. It was John's method of transferring his failing company's debts onto someone else's shoulders. What recourse do victims have? Limited. If they sign the documents, they're legally bound unless they can prove fraud or coercion given John's careful construction of the paperwork. That's extremely difficult to establish. Walter pulled out specific documents showing John's company obligations. Green Development owes approximately $2.8 million to various creditors. John transferred roughly half that amount to family members through these fake gift schemes. So the recipients inherit debt instead of assets. Precisely. They believe they're receiving valuable property when they're actually accepting financial liabilities that will destroy them. Walter's professional demeanor couldn't hide his disgust. It's particularly cruel because it exploits family trust. I studied the timeline Walter provided. John had been executing this scheme for over a year, carefully selecting targets who would sign documents without legal review. Daniel's naive trust had made him a perfect mark. When will the FBI move on this? Soon. They're building cases against both John and the family members who knowingly participated, though I suspect most victims were genuinely deceived rather than complicit. Most victims. That phrase suggested some people might have understood the scheme but participated anyway. Had Daniel suspected anything? Had his enthusiasm for John's generosity included willful blindness to obvious red flags? What happens to the transferred properties? Civil forfeiture if purchased with fraud proceeds. The families lose everything they thought they gained, plus face liability for the underlying debts John transferred. Walter gathered his papers. It's a complete financial catastrophe for anyone involved. I thanked Walter and left the cafe with a comprehensive understanding of Daniel's situation. My son hadn't just chosen money over family. He'd chosen criminal money that would ultimately destroy him. The poetic justice was almost too perfect to believe. The drive home took me past Daniel's neighborhood where expensive houses stood like monuments to misplaced priorities. Behind those impressive facades, families faced financial ruin because they trusted the wrong person for the wrong reasons. Daniel had made his choice on Thanksgiving Day. Now he would live with every consequence that choice had created. Without assistance from the father he'd abandoned. Justice sometimes wore federal badges and carried legal documents, but it still counted as justice. 9 days passed in quiet satisfaction. The Martha Miller Memorial Foundation distributed its first cancer family assistance grants, helping 3 families cover treatment costs that insurance wouldn't touch. Martha would have approved of the practical help, reaching people who faced the same battles we'd fought together. Daniel called twice more during the holiday week, each conversation shorter and more desperate than the last. I listened politely to his escalating panic about mounting bills and legal complications, offering sympathy, but no solutions. He'd created this crisis through his own choices. He could resolve it through the same agency. New Year's Day brought reflection on my transformation from grieving widower to strategic architect of justice. 12 months ago, I'd been planning Martha's final Thanksgiving, desperately hoping Daniel would spend time with his dying mother. Today, I sat in my study reviewing foundation documents that proved grief could be channeled into purpose rather than consumed by bitterness. The doorbell rang at 4 o'clock on January 2nd, interrupting my review of scholarship applications. Daniel stood on my porch looking haggard and desperate, his expensive clothes wrinkled and his confident demeanor completely shattered. "Dad, I need to talk to you. It's about my inheritance." I invited him into the study where Martha's photograph watched from its silver frame. Daniel collapsed into the chair across from my desk, his hands shaking as he tried to compose himself. The house situation is worse than I told you. John didn't just trap us in debt. He made us liable for his entire company's obligations. We could lose everything we own, plus face criminal charges for participating in fraud. Daniel's voice cracked. I need access to my inheritance now. It's the only thing that can save us. I opened the desk drawer and withdrew the foundation documents, spreading them across the mahogany surface like evidence in a trial. Daniel, let me show you your inheritance. His eyes scanned the papers frantically. What is this? Martha Miller Memorial Foundation. Your inheritance. Every dollar and I accumulated over 40 years now helps families fighting cancer and students pursuing engineering degrees. I pointed to the beneficiary designation. You receive exactly $1 to prevent legal challenges to the will. Daniel's face went white. You can't be serious. Completely serious. You chose money over family. So, I chose worthy recipients over an ungrateful heir. But this is everything. The house, the savings, the life insurance. It's all gone. All redirected to people who appreciate opportunities rather than taking them for granted. I leaned back in my chair, feeling profound satisfaction. The foundation has already helped more families in 2 months than you helped your own family in 2 years. Daniel stared at the documents like a man watching his future dissolve. You planned this. You knew about John's troubles, and you let me walk into the trap. I planned nothing. You walked into that trap yourself when you decided John Green's approval mattered more than 43 years of family loyalty. I picked up Martha's photograph. She warned me about your changing priorities. I should have listened sooner. Dad, please. I was wrong about Thanksgiving, wrong about John, wrong about everything. But I'm still your son. Yes, you are. And as my son, you have exactly the same inheritance I received from my father. The opportunity to build your own life through honest work and sound decisions. I returned the foundation papers to their folder. Nothing more, nothing less. Daniel sat in stunned silence while the weight of his situation settled around him like gathering darkness. Outside, winter afternoon light faded over the lake where Martha and I had walked through 40 years of seasons together. The house, the debts, the legal troubles. You'll face them the same way millions of people face difficult circumstances every day through personal responsibility and determination rather than inherited wealth. Daniel rose unsteadily and walked to the door, pausing at the threshold like someone hoping for reprieve that wouldn't come. I can't believe you destroy your own son this way. I didn't destroy anything, Daniel. I simply allowed natural consequences to teach lessons that loving words never could. I remained seated at my desk, surrounded by papers that represented justice served, and Martha's memory honored. You chose your path. Now you get to walk it. The door closed behind him with quiet finality. Through the study window, I watched Daniel drive away into the gathering twilight, carrying the full weight of choices that could no longer be avoided or postponed. Martha smiled at me from her photograph, her expression warm with approval. The foundation documents lay beside her image like promises kept, and justice delivered through patience rather than anger. Outside, snow began falling on the lake, where we'd shared so many peaceful evenings. Inside, everything felt complete and purposeful and exactly as it should be. If you like this story, please like this video, subscribe to the channel, and share your impressions of this story in the comments. To listen to the next story, click on the box on the left. Thank you for watching.